Welcome to Energize Community Impact with Dean Eaton and J.R. Woodward, my special guest. Hi, J.R. How are you?
Hey there. Good to see you, Dean.
How's everything in the US?
Well, not bad here. It's a little cool in Seattle and cloudy as typical, but yeah, I'm doing good, man.
Good, good. Well, I'm getting ready to go rowing with my wife very shortly here in Melbourne. We've got some beautiful weather today, so that's what we're going to be doing.
Perfect. That sounds great.
It's good just for you to join us again on behalf of Chorus Connect for our Energize Community Impact interviews. We are here, of course, to start this conversation with churches who are interested and individuals, church planters, so that they'll become energized for community impact. I'm your host, Dean Eaton, Director of Community Impact for Chorus Connect Australia, and our special guest is J.R. Woodward, who has been passionately planting churches across the West Coast and East Coast of the US with some fantastic values that we often repeat in introducing him, because I love to get these into my own thinking, right? You value tight-knit community, life-transforming discipleship, locally rooted mission, I love that, and boundary-crossing mission. These values are fantastic, JR. For 25 years, you've been applying these to church plants and creating a church planting movement, some of which you've encapsulated or distilled in a couple of fantastic books. One of them is Creating a Missional Culture from InterVarsity Press, and The Church as Movement with Dan White Jr., also on InterVarsity Press. And I believe you were just recently with Dan. Is that right? How's he doing?
Yeah. We spent some time in. He moved recently to Puerto Rico to start the Caneo Center, which is kind of for weary and worn out pastors. So it's a great place. We did some dreaming about V3 and the future. So
it sounds like I saw the pictures. It looks like a dreamy place. I have a hunch there'd be pastors lining up for that ticket, right, to get in there.
Oh yeah, it's pretty. Yeah, they've kind of filled up quite quickly.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I want to mention too that you're the co-founder of Missio Alliance, and that you currently serve as the national director for the V3 church planting movement, which people can find out a lot more about if they go to look up V3 church planting. Is that right?
Yeah, well, if they look at the V3 movement, that's kind of our website, and they can learn about kind of some of the free webinars, the 4 to 6 week immersions, as well as the 8-month cohorts that we do there.
Wonderful. And we're going to be, Chorus Connect, of course, are doing this 12-month program with churches in Australia around revitalizing their church well-being, as well as energizing their community impacts and helping church planters to do the same. But a lot of what we do is a kind of entree, to then refer people on to the sort of V3 type resources. And we're particularly keen in the resources that you offer, JR, and prescribing them and recommending them to people. And so these interviews are a great window for people to get a little bit of an idea, of a little taster, really, I think, of the sort of training you guys offer. That's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So it's a good entree. And we should mention too, you're the co-founder of the Praxis Gathering. You've written for numerous websites and journals. You've got a Master's of Arts in Global Leadership from Fuller Theological Seminary and a PhD from the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom, the land of warm beer and cold pies.
I didn't know it had that reputation, but yeah, they definitely don't have that too much spicy food. I like spicy food.
Yeah, in Australia we say we like our beer cold and our pies hot, and they kind of have these cold pork pies and these warm beers, and we don't get it. It's anyway. Today we do want to discuss the topic of creating a missional culture, but firstly, a little word from our sponsor, and that is Chorus Connect.
Hi, I'm Dawn Penny, CEO of Chorus Connect. Central to our work at Chorus Connect is the belief that local people need to be the catalyst for bringing about real and lasting change within their own community. We work with like-minded individuals, churches, government, community organisations and public services to facilitate community initiatives that foster connection, collaboration, engagement and care. We offer training, support and job placement for people in school chaplaincy, community connector and church planting roles. Come and join our amazing team at Chorus Connect and find out more by visiting chorusconnect.org.au.
Okay, back with J.R. Woodward, and we're talking about creating a missional culture. Can you outline what you mean by the cultural web and tell us why it matters in creating missional culture? And I think I've got a couple of things we can share on screen with people as a visual.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
I think maybe the first thing I think about, and one of the things I tried to address in creating a missional culture is how oftentimes in the West, we kind of approach spiritual formation from an individual orientation instead of thinking about the power of the culture of the congregation itself. And so I talk about there how leaders create culture and then the culture recreates the congregation. And so the culture of the congregation is like gravity. It has the power to pull us down to our most base instincts or lift us up to our sacred potential. And so every church has a culture, whether it's named or not. And it's important to understand the cultural web when it comes to forming culture, because it basically gives us the different elements that create culture. And so I've developed an acronym called LAMPS, which is spelt uniquely. Maybe a way to remember. There's 2 A's and 2 M's in that, and I think it's hopefully easy way to remember. And I think the reason I thought about lamps is kind of John the Revelator in Revelation talks about the lampstands and how the lampstands stand for the churches that Jesus was speaking into. And so that would be some of the reasons that I think understanding the cultural web is the importance of that is that's how you establish culture, and culture shapes us. And so when I think about the cultural web, if we look through this acronym here, there's language. What does the language of the congregation you serve reveal? There's the artifacts. What cultural goods that we've created? What do they communicate? Assumptions. These are what are the faith assumptions and values that shape our decisions and actions. Mission is just kind of what is God calling us to do. Marks is what does it mean to be faithful and fruitful, which is a super important question. Practices, what are the core practices in which we're engaging? Because obviously that shapes us as a people. And strategy deals with how will we fulfill God's calling together. So I want to kind of go through these different elements because to me, they kind of are a good way to think about all the elements of culture that shape us. So, so this is John the Revelator. He kind of says, when I turned to see who was speaking to me, I saw 7 gold lampstands, and standing in the middle of the lampstands was someone like the Son of Man. He was wearing a long robe with a gold sash across his chest. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were like flames of fire. His feet were like polished bronze, refined in a furnace, and his voice thundered like a mighty ocean waves. He held 7 stars in his right hand, and a sharp 2-edged sword came from his mouth, and his face was like the sun in all its brilliance. The 7 stars, it should say, are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. So again, that's kind of where I use LAMPS as kind of a nice acronym to remind us of this. So first we got language. How does language shape the congregations that we serve, or the language that we use? How does it reveal our culture? I think we're probably both fans of Leslie Newbegin. And he says this, it's a very insightful thing about language. He says, culture is the sum total ways of living developed by a group of human beings and handed on from generation to generation. Central to culture is language. The language of a people provide the means by which they express their way of perceiving things and coping with them. Around the center, one would have to group their visual and musical arts, their technologies, their law, and their social and political organization. And one must also include in culture, as a fundamental to any culture, a set of belief, experiences, and practices that seek to grasp and express the ultimate nature of things, that which gives shape and meaning to life, that which claims final loyalty. And so when I think about language, I really do think like how we use language is super important if we're kind of wanting to develop a missional culture. And we've talked about missional theology and so forth already. But I think like for example, one thing that maybe is fairly fundamental that I think we need to change is when people say, let's go to the church. What does that reveal about church? You know, church is something that we go to. Church is potentially a building or a meeting once a week. And if we kind of think of church in that way, it's very reductionistic. I think we need to realize that we are the church. And so we go to a worship service, but we are the church. And when we think about we are the church, then that kind of makes church something that's 24/7, 7 days a week, and something that we're always living out. And so I think that when we think about language, there may be some words that we need to eliminate or use very differently. So we talked earlier about clergy and laity. I think the Bible talks about us all as clergy and all as laity. So we don't need to make that distinction. So maybe some questions I think about when it comes to language is what words are important in developing a missional culture? What words might we need to leave behind? So for example, I'm not a huge fan of volunteers because I think volunteers kind of gives the impression that I can choose to do this or do that. But if we're a part of the body of Christ, then when we don't do our part in the body, that makes the body less healthy, right? So I think when you think about how to name people in the body of Christ, we can learn a lot from how Paul does that. He calls us sent ones and priests and saints and missionaries and ambassadors. And these are much more, valuable words, ministers that I think we could adopt instead of simply volunteers.
Yeah.
And then
JR,
yes.
Just going to throw something in there. This week in talking with Alan Hirsch about this language thing, he was making the point that often we talk about wanting to be gospel centered, right? And he said the problem with that is gospel, it sounds like an abstract doctrine rather than Jesus, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So are we Jesus centered or are we gospel? In other words, a particular dogma centered.
Because it's possible, I guess, to be gospel depending on how we define that term, because some people define it very reductionistically. But when you say Jesus centered, it's obviously we think about the life, death, and resurrection and all that represents. But so I think language is super important. I think if we just kind of monitor it, think about it, realize that we create language, language recreates us, much like culture does. So the second thing in the cultural web is artifacts. And these are, the question I ask here is, what do the cultural goods that we've created communicate? And so obviously we have the Holy Scriptures, but we also have mission statements. The songs that we sing kind of shape us. I kind of think about, I'm doing a pretty deep study on Philippians now, and one of the central and probably the most key verses in the book is the Christ hymn in Philippians 2. And it's interesting that they actually sang this hymn, and that's what shaped them. That's what helped to transform them to be more like Jesus, was actually singing. So what we sing makes a difference. The places that we gather and even how we gather, I kind of mentioned in the Creating a Missional Culture when I visited a church in Chicago, how they met in the round. And there was kind of this aisle that went north and south and east and west. And, I kind of asked the question, where do you think the preacher stood? And when I asked this, with different pastors and different people where I speak, they often say probably the middle, because, that way they have a good view of everybody. But in this case, they preached from the very edge of the circle. I think it was on the west side. And so I kind of asked, like, what does that say? What does that actually communicate without saying a word? And in the center of the circle, by the way, was the table with the bread and the wine, which represented Jesus at the center. And so you have this communicator on the edge, which I think kind of communicates like, hey, I'm a part of you. I may be a priest ministering to priests, but we're all a part of this, and Jesus is the center of this community. And so there's a lot more I could talk about that, but like these are all kind of artifacts that really kind of shape how people take in the things that we do. And so some of the questions here is like, what visual icons do we use to represent us? What pieces of literature do we use to help people understand us? What tools do we use that are synonymous with our values? What does our website reveal about us? And where do people find our mission statement, our vision, values, practices, strategy, and what it means for us to be successful or fruitful? And so those are some of the things, or the artifacts that might shape us. I think the third thing deals with assumptions. What are the faith assumptions and values that shape our decisions and actions? And I think, like in this case, like you usually, even if you have a couple leaders that are kind of working together on mission, it's not until we actually get into practice that we start to unravel what our underlying assumptions are, especially if we have a disagreement on a particular decision. One of the things I talk about in the church's movement is like, I have the assumption when it comes to being the church that I think maybe the church today has this assumption of that what we believe determines, or what we behave determines what, or what we believe and behave determines whether we belong. And I think that in an incarnational approach to mission, we need to give people a space of belonging. And when we did this in Los Angeles, when we gave them a space to belong, because the core of that group was behaving differently, people started to imitate our behavior, and before long, they had different beliefs. And usually, it wasn't until we were ready to baptize people that people realize, hey, I'm a Christian. Can I get baptized as well? And so I think that's kind of some assumptions that we have on what it means to be on mission together. But I think we have to ask, maybe what are the 6 or 8 core values of our community? What are our assumptions about God, and how do those assumptions shape our practices? What are our underlying assumptions that we have about discipleship and mission? I kind of mentioned the mission part. Next session that we're together, we'll talk a little bit more discipleship and maybe some assumptions there that I have and try to identify. I think it's important. What are our assumptions as it relates to who leads and how we lead? And what are our assumptions about how we relate to one another? The second, or the next element of mission, or this kind of cultural web, deals with mission. And this is really just, what is God calling us to do? There's a church in New York that their mission statement is joining God in the renewal of all things. And I think that kind of says a lot, right? It kind of says, first of all, joining God. In other words, we don't start off with kind of, this is what we want to do, but we're joining God. This shows an intelligence of missional theology that we've already talked about. And the renewal of all things kind of speaks to how we understand where God's bringing the world, right? And if God's going to renew all things, then we're going to be participating in that. There's another one that talks, their mission statement is reflect one, restore many, renew all. And there's a church in Portland that actually had no mission statement. They just had 3 visuals. They had a tabernacle, a table, and then I think the third one was a tier. I kind of wrote that wrong there, but like the tabernacle, or the tent, kind of represented, the church and our gathering. The table, it kind of represented the community and kind of our outreach, and the tier represented the compassion that we have and just kind of working for justice. Another one in Washington, D.C., it was kind of oriented around 3 words: worship, community, and justice. And that justice was kind of just a broader understanding of mission. And within that, obviously comes our own kind of evangelism and helping other people come to know Christ in justification, if you will. N.T. Wright talks a lot about justice and justification. So the questions here is like, have we crafted a succinct statement about the specificity of our mission? Does our mission capture the imagination of people? Does our mission seem grounded in scripture? How well do people remember and internalize our mission? Those are some of the things I think about. The next one, the next element is super important. It's the marks. And I think too many people and too many churches haven't really identified what does it mean to be faithful and fruitful in God's mission. And when I think about, again, today, maybe the typical church thinks about how many people come to our Sunday gathering. We look at our building and our, money, and those tend to be the three things. I think those things are helpful, but like reductionistic if that's all we're thinking about. And so for me, I think it's important to think about statistics and stories. In other words, like there's a qualitative and quantitative way that we measure fruitfulness. Yeah, it's important. Are we seeing new Christians? Are we seeing lives transformed? How do you kind of measure the transformation of a life? Because I think when I go to pastors' conference, at least years ago, people used to ask me, how many people are part of your congregation? They don't ask like, so what are some transformative stories that are happening in the people in your congregation or in your neighborhood? I think those are more qualitative things that we need to measure as well. Joseph Myers says this: we measure that which we perceive to be important. That which we measure will become important and will guide our process. That which we do not measure will become less important. So measurement has a dynamic power over the journey and results. It is not neutral. Our way of measuring is not a neutral tool that simply tells us what there is to see. No, our way of measuring influences the facts in a way that has a profound effect on our perception of reality. And so I think like statistics and stories is a little bit more holistic way to think about what it means to be faithful and fruitful. And so both what we measure and how we measure are important. So, one of the ways I think about measurements is kind of when we talked about the fivefold and the telos that they're kind of trying to bring the whole congregation, those elements of telos are a good way to kind of measure the qualitative work of the church, which I think today, if you think about, is probably the most important. We have a lot of churches that could become big and they fall within a day. I think about Mars Hill here in Seattle, poor leadership, poor culture. And so I think we really need this kind of qualitative measure as well as quantitative. And then finally, there's the practices, not finally here. We have practices, which are, what are the core practices in which we're engaging? And, this kind of relates to kind of, for us, every discipleship core has a rule and rhythm of life. The rule is kind of the spiritual disciplines that we engage. The rhythm is how often do we engage them, daily, weekly, monthly, annually. And I love this quote by Marjorie Thompson. She says, the caterpillar must yield up the life it knows and submit to the mystery of interior transformation. It emerges from the process transfigured with wings that give it freedom to fly. A rule of life gives us a way to enter into the lifelong process of personal transformation. Its disciplines help us to shed the familiar but constricting old self and allow our new self in Christ to be formed the true self that is naturally attracted to the light of God. And so oftentimes in our intimate space, which we've talked about the four spaces a little in depth the last time we met, I think about communion, community, commission is a good way to define the holistic nature of the church and what the church does. I think it's also a good way to think about practices. What are some of the practices as it relates to communion, our relationship with God? What are some practices that are important to be kind of committed to as it relates to community and building relationships with each other? And what are some core practices as it relates to commission and being on mission in a holistic sense? And then finally, there's strategy. And that's kind of how will we fulfill God's calling together? And again, this kind of goes back to the understanding the four spaces of belonging. We have to ask the question, what are we reproducing? And is it replicable? Because that's what movemental would be. In other words, is it simple enough to be reproduced by just about everybody? And so when it comes to the 4 spaces, we really encourage multiplying a personal space, which is more of a bounded set, illustrated by the dark circle, which is kind of the center of a more centered set, which is dotted, which means anybody can become a part of. I think if this is the core thing that we're reproducing, that's what it means to be movemental in our day. So those are some of the elements of the web by lamps, language, artifacts, assumptions, mission, marks, practices, and strategy.
Wow, it really does give us a great framework for going through all of the elements that we need to develop to create a missional culture. And it seems that if a church leadership team or a church planting team were to take that acronym, to work through each of those phases, those steps, to take their time on them, it would take them through what our friend from the UK, Mike Moyner, likes to describe, and you talked a bit about last episode, and that is the sort of identity voyage that people have to go through in the missional space. You know, who we were in the traditional church space and who we are in the missional space can be quite different, and who we're doing it with can change what we do and who we become. There's a lot in that, but this gives all of the elements that enable us to work through with others in order for us to discover that new identity together as we participate with God in mission.
And I find that like churches that go through this really kind of enjoy the process. It's really helpful for them, and it really does kind of re-energize them to be on mission and to kind of live out their calling.
You know, I guess Palmer Parker would pipe in at this point and say, don't underestimate the pain of the inner journey around that. You know, you can do the external work around it, but it's what the Spirit starts to do within us around those processes too, isn't it? That challenge us and shape us, and it's a real work of the Holy Spirit. And I once had an elder in one of the churches I was pastoring, and he had a tremendous mission heart. And anytime somebody would share some great vision about mission that they had, something fresh from the Lord that they felt as a mandate, he would get this particular smile, and he would look at us and say, "That's going to be painful."
That's great.
I love it, but it's going to be painful.
And, but like with birth, it's painful, but there's a joy in the end, right? So
exactly. JR, what you've shared with us today is tremendously helpful. Creating a missional culture, it can be explored further in your book. I was talking to a church planter this week who said to me that he's a church planter today because he read Creating a Missional Culture a few years ago, and he'd done his theology degree and all that, and he was wondering what he's going to do with his life and had a sense of no direction. But he read Creating a Missional Culture, and he sensed the call of God to church plant, and now he's doing it successfully here in Australia. And that was for him something that really put it together for him. And so that and the church's movement, a couple of great books, the V3 movement resources, and the access to those things are available if people go to your website. Thank you for today. We look forward to our next episode with you, which is really something that I love to explore, and that is making disciples. We'll look forward to seeing you next time where we talk about that. Thank you, JR.
Yeah, looking forward to it, Dean. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi, I'm Dawn Penny, CEO of Chorus Connect. The seeds of God's preferred future for your community are already growing within your church. Chorus Connect offers you and your church a way of cultivating this new growth through embarking upon a 12-month training and mentoring journey that will foster well-being and energize your church's community impact. Energize your church's community impact by emailing us today on eci-training@chorusconnect.org.au or calling us on 03 9811 0999.